You're watching BCTV. We're all about Brantford. You're watching BCTV, Brantford Government Television, a service of Brantford Community Television. This program is brought to you in part through the support of the town of Brantford.
We'll call this meeting of the Brantford Planning and Zoning Commission to order. It is Thursday, October 3rd, 2019. I'll introduce members of our commission and staff. To my far right, we have Commission Member John Lust. Next to John, Commission Member Joe Chadwick. Next to Joe, Commission Member Joe Viuzzo. Turning the corner, we have Commission Member Fred Russo. Next to Fred, Commission Member Paul Higgins. Our staff this evening is Assistant Planner Rich Stecker. Next to Rich right now is Harry Smith, and somewhere around is our attorney Danielle Bercury, and in the corner is our clerk recording secretary Michelle Martin. I'm Chuck Anders, our chair, and I'll ask Paul to read the notice of public hearing.
The Planning and Zoning Commission of the town of Brantford, Connecticut hereby gives notice of a public hearing to be held on Thursday, October 3rd, 2019 at 7 p.m. at the Brantford Fire Headquarters, 45 North Main Street, Brantford, Connecticut, to consider the following. Number one, application number 19-8.12, special exception to establish a new multifamily residential use in place of existing office use on the second floor located at 1032-1064 Main Street. 1064 Main Street LLC, care of Alex Vigliotti, applicant and owner. At said hearings, all persons will have the right to be heard and written communications will be received. A copy of the application is in file in the Planning and Zoning Commissioner's office at the Planning and Zoning Department, 1019 Main Street, Brantford, Connecticut.
Thank you, Paul. We have two public hearings scheduled for this evening. The first one is a continuation of our public hearing we started at our last meeting, and that's the Beacon one. The second one is 1064 Main Street, and I understand that the applicant for the second one has requested to go first because it may be quick. Mr. Hollister, is that okay with you? Because you have a right to go first. You're first on the agenda. Are you? Happy
to yield to my friend, Mr. Vigliotti.
Okay. So with that, we'll consider item number 2. And the commission fine with that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, and this is 1064 Main Street, 1032-64 Main Street is the address, Main Street LLC, and a special exception to convert a second floor office space to residential apartments. You ready to proceed?
We're ready. Jim Preddy, Criscolo Engineering.
Probably should take a mic.
Jim Preddy, Criscolo Engineering here in Brantford. Also with me is Joe Seapot, architect for this project. 1032 to 1064 Middletown Avenue, existing,
Main Street.
Main Street, existing building, retail on the first floor. There's a jeweler and Fired Up and a Chinese store, restaurant. The second floor is currently office space. The proposal is to convert it to residential units. The only change to the outside of the building will be a secondary stair access in this back corner of the building. Existing pavement, parking exists out there. There's another building on the property that has 4 one-bedroom units in it currently. The change of use in the current parking regs actually make this, what we're doing, more conforming than it was before. The office space actually required far more parking spaces than what was required. And I'm going to let Joe just kind of run you really quick through what we're doing inside.
Hi, my name is Joe Seapot, Joseph Seapot Architect here in Brantford. This is a pretty straightforward application. We have an existing building, and what we're looking to do is convert the upstairs second floor that is currently office space. Office space isn't renting right now. It's a very tough sell. And what we're looking to do is to convert that to apartments, which is part of the town center mission, is to bring more people into the downtown area. So what we're looking to do is to convert it into 5 one-bedroom units and 3 studio apartments. We're going to be adding an elevator off the back entry into here. And then we have a back stair, which Jim mentioned, as a second means of egress. This little bump out here is for the nail salon or the beauty salon that's over here. The existing building was built around 1925. It's a very nice building, and we're keeping the aesthetics of the building. We're, not changing that at all. That's pretty much what we're going to be doing with the space. So,
Great. Thank you. Rich, did you prepare the staff report on this?
Yes, I did. As Jim and Joe highlighted, what we're doing here is, what they're doing is switching the office space on the second floor to residential multifamily. And that's, it's the four one-bedroom units are also located existing on Hillside Avenue. The 2019 Plan of Conservation and Development encourages mixed-use development that contributes to the character and vibrancy of the town center district. Having more residential use down there would do that. Recent changes to the zoning regulations have reduced the requirements for restaurants and retail space in the town center district. Using the parking reduction formula requirement for retail and restaurant uses in the town center, the parking requirement has been significantly reduced. This is in the BC zoning district, residential uses permitted. Landscaping, there are some improvements on the, if we can show that, two areas on the, in front of the hillside spot here. So ripping up some pavement.
Could you grab the mic, Rich?
So we're taking up the pavement, these two areas, and that's going to be a landscaped plot there. That would require a landscaping plan to be submitted and approved by the planning staff. The rest of the area, in terms of any kind of landscaping, it's obviously not seen from the road, and a lot of the fence takes up the rest of the. It would be any kind of side yard or rear yard landscaping. The parking calculation, the old calculation would have required maybe 60 parking spaces, which would never be attainable. So by using the new parking formulas that reduce parking for restaurants by 25% and 0 for retail, the required parking is reduced significantly and just comes in under 17.5 parking spaces, and where there's 18 off-street parking spaces supplied. So that's a good thing. And that was effective with the Main Street Overlay District. Overlay District, which went into effect on October 1st. Outdoor lighting, again, is one of the key improvements that can take place here, in terms of floodlights and old mercury vapor types of lighting. Town Center Village District, it's was reviewed by the Town Center Revitalization Review Board on August 21st, and they recommended approval of the second floor conversion project as presented. No existing traffic circulation has been significantly impacted. Let's see, there are no inland wetlands or jurisdictional area within 100 feet. And the town engineer has reviewed the site plan and noted that the use change from office to residential requires a WPCA approval. There is no change in impervious surface calculation requiring any drainage improvements. As stated, there will be an elevator in the rear of the building and 2 other access points, one in the back and The front stairwell will stay in effect. Rear parking lot will be restriped and a bike rack installed. And there will be a new dumpster enclosure location in the rear parking lot. So we put together some conditions fairly standard for lighting. So to replace the existing non-compliant lighting, a landscape plan submitted and reviewed, approved by town planner for landscape planting areas in front of the two-story house fronting on hillside. Documentation that the use has been reviewed and approved by the WPCA. And then to ensure continued compliance with the zoning regulation, landscaping must be maintained as an ongoing requirement. No additional signage or new replacement lighting shall be installed without planning or zoning commission approval. All conditions of previous approvals regarding the property shall remain in full force and effect as they may still apply. So it really is kind of a nice way to put together some options to create more vibrancy in the downtown, allowing residential on the second floor. There was we discussed a little bit about in terms of there is some problems always in tight downtown areas, but maybe because there's also a mix of retail, restaurant, and now a little bit more residential. May add one more condition stating that on street parking on Main Street and Hillside is limited to 2 hours durations. The owner shall inform the residential tenants that on-street parking may not exceed 2 hours intervals. Off-street parking is available on site, 18 parking spaces, along with nearby public parking opportunities. So there are parking opportunities behind the stores on Main Street and down the street a little on Hillside Avenue.
Thank you, Rich. On the parking issue, would you expect that any of the 8 units would be assigned a space within the rear parking lot, or do you know?
I don't know if they'll actually be assigned, but they'll be available. Residential and retail use basically has opposite hours.
Right. Right. You don't have any problem with the condition that Rich mentioned? It is, yeah, one of the concerns. It is 2-hour parking. You wouldn't want to have that to be permanent parking on this on the street parking. Okay. Questions from the commission?
Any idea when you're going through the WPCA?
Next meeting, we canceled this one, so we second Tuesday.
Okay.
Anything else? Any members of the public wish to comment? One more time, any members of the public wish to comment? Seeing none. Any further questions or comments by commission members or staff? If not, we can close this matter as a public hearing, and this may be something we can take up later. Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us to our other public hearing, which is item number 1 on the agenda. That's Beacon Communities, Town of Brantford Housing Authority. That's the Parkside Village one. Just a reminder, this one is it's a continuation of public hearing. Just remind a few things. This is an application. It's an 830G application, an application under the Affordable Housing Appeals Act. It's different than than most applications in that under the standard, under this application, if the commission were to deny it or to approve it with conditions that the applicant thought were unreasonable, it would be up to and he took an appeal, it would be up to the commission on appeal to demonstrate that the reasons for denial are based on substantial public interests in public health, safety, or other matters that it can consider, that those substantial public interests clearly outweigh the need for affordable housing, and that those public interests cannot be addressed by reasonable changes in the plan. Also, a reminder, what's going on is this application has been before us in a number of years. It's had a history, it's had an appeal. But the issue before us now concerns conditions of a prior approval regarding the emergency access. That's what is before us now. And one of the reasons we continued this public hearing is to allow our fire marshal to attend. And is he here this evening? Yes, he is. Great. So I'm sure we'll have some questions for you. With that, Mr. Hollis, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, sir. Yes, we're celebrating our second anniversary in front of this commission. So.
All right.
I've just given you copies of the September 30th letter that I had emailed to Mr. Smith, and then a small diagram which I will refer to in my remarks. Tim Hollister, Hartford, representing the applicant, along with Attorney Jay Pottinger, and with me is Mr. Versteeg, our fire safety consultant, and David Golubuski from TPA. We're going to try to wrap this up tonight for you. So let me just review the September 30th letter. The application that's before you presents three options. Option number one is to leave the emergency pullover where it was shown on the May 2019 version of the plans, what we're looking at 3 or 4 months ago, and then revise conditions 5C and D, basically to just accept it as a site plan condition, and we've given you the specific proposed revised language for combining that in our August 26 cover letter. Option number two is to move the pullover onto the Parkside property entirely. That's shown on the plan that we submitted when we were here on September 19th. There was an original August 26 plan. The fire marshal said he didn't like the dimensions of the reconfigured plan, so Mr. Sacco gave you further revision that did comply, we believe, with what the fire marshal was looking for. So option number two is to move the pullover entirely onto the Parkside plan and then revise the conditions 5C and D as we had suggested. Option number three is to eliminate the pullover entirely. Option three is possible because the pullover is not, as you'll have heard from Mr. Versteeg and will hear again, the pullover is not required by the applicable fire code, but we do recognize that it is contrary to the recommendation, the demand of the fire marshal dating back to 2017. It's on the plan because we were attempting to accommodate the fire marshal's request. So option one, we believe, is sufficient, but we have been discussing whether an easement or a deed restriction is necessary from the town, and option two at least has the advantage of eliminating that issue by moving the pullover entirely onto the Parkside property. Adopting the revised site plan condition 5C and 5D will guarantee that the pullover will be maintained permanently, and as I added in my letter, the applicants will further agree to stripe it and install signage within the pullover so it is absolutely clear that the area will be kept clear for emergency vehicles. So the one remaining question from September 19th was, well, what if someone tried to build a fence or a wall on the small sliver of land between the pullover and as relocated onto the Parkside property, and where Sliney Road would ends and would cross over into the Parkside property. And that is the area that I've illustrated in yellow on the small map that I just gave you. Is an easement or a deed restriction necessary to ensure that a fire truck or emergency vehicle can drive over that yellow area? That was the lingering question. And the answer is no, and there are several reasons for that. Number one is fire trucks and emergency vehicles can drive wherever they need to drive. They are not limited by easements. They're not directed by easements, not to be flipped, but as we said, they don't check the land records when they're on the way to respond to an emergency. They can drive through fences, and they can drive around walls. They can push cars or other obstructions out of the way. Number two, it is complete speculation that someone would propose to block off that area at issue. It is the access, the decades-established access to a public park. A fence or wall there would completely disrupt the current use of the park. Number 3, a fence or a wall would interfere with the public access easement over Sliney Road that this commission has requested and the applicant has agreed to grant under condition 2E of the June 2019 action. Number 4 is and I see now that Mr. Smith has disagreed with me on this, but I'll say it anyway. A fence or wall would violate section 6.2.E8 of the zoning regulations, which says that a fence or a wall cannot interfere with a right-of-way. I would characterize at least informally what is there as a right-of-way because it is an access that the public uses to get to the park. And finally, any fence wall obstruction would require the fire marshal's approval, but that would completely contradict the whole reason we're here in the first place, which is that the fire marshal, dating back to 2017, said he wanted a pullover on the northwest side of the redevelopment, which is why it's there in the first place. So they would be essentially going 180 degrees from what we have been doing now for the past 2 years. So put in terms of Section 830G, which the chairman referenced, there is, we don't believe, any legal or factual basis to deny option 2. There is just speculation about a fence or a wall, and that is not a proper basis. Now, Mr. Smith handed me a memo dated today, which I just saw for the first time a few minutes ago, but and I'm sure he'll explain it to you, but let me explain, in response to that, let me explain one more thing. Mr. Smith is, I believe, is saying that the applicants are proposing to use someone else's property in support of their own redevelopment. We are not proposing to use town land as part of this redevelopment. We're simply recognizing that Parkside abuts a town park, which is an area where an emergency vehicle might drive to get to a fire at the Parkside property. That is not a use of town land, that's just a recognition that fire trucks can drive anywhere that they want. Mr. Smith also appears to make the assertion that the town of Brantford has not consented. The town of Brantford has been on notice of what we have been doing since 2016 and has never raised an issue. In fact, the only input from the town, other than the accepting the property line adjustment, which is now the basis of the plan, has been the fire marshal's demand that there be a pullover on the northwest side. So the town has intimately shaped what is before you, and I don't believe that can now be retracted. And the final answer, which nobody supports, I believe, is if the town objects to the use of that land, then the answer is to just eliminate the pullover entirely. We don't support that. The fire marshal doesn't support that, but if push comes to shove, that would be the very disagreeable way that we would have to deal with it. Now, I want to bring Mr. Versteeg up just a minute to reinforce some of the fire safety issues. Joe?
Good evening. Joe Versteeg, fire safety consultant for the applicant. Just 3 quick points. As Attorney Hollister has already stated, that the emergency pullover was not required by code or by statute. There's no regulation that actually requires it, but it was merely provided simply at the request of the fire marshal. That stated, the emergency vehicle turning radii of this area allows the fire truck to turn around or even back out on Sliney Road. And probably the most important thing to note or remember from my prior written testimony was that there are a number of state statutes that you have before you that the emergency vehicle does not need any consent or easement. It is allowed, emergency vehicles, including fire trucks, are allowed to go wherever they want, whenever they want. And I just wanted to make those 3 points to you. Any questions or comments?
Not at this time, thank you.
Just to wrap up our initial comments, we would ask the commission to act tonight. And I don't know if you have a resolution prepared, but I'm going to ask you to do 3 fairly straightforward things. And maybe you want to write them down, and we can come back to them later. The first one is to approve the relocation of the pullover onto the Parkside property as we showed it on TPA's plan from September 19th. Number 2 is to modify the conditions 5C and 5D as requested in our August 26th letter. And number 3 is to add to your June 13th approval the clarification letter from Attorney Berkery that was dated August 14th. If you do those 3 things, then we are content, and we will not bother you anymore. So that's my initial presentation, Mr. Chairman, and I believe you want to hear from the fire marshal and others.
Thank you, Mr. Hollister. Before we hear from our fire marshal, perhaps I'm going to ask our town planner to review his report, and then we'll have some questions and comments from, like to hear from our fire marshal. So we'll start with you, Harry.
Okay. Thank you. Before I get going, I just want to take care of a housekeeping item. I want to formally enter into the record of this application all materials from the previous applications filed on the Affordable Housing Appeals Statute. So we have them here, so we're just formally filing those into the record of this application. Even though some of the comments from the memo I just passed out to the commission have already been covered by Attorney Hollister, I'm just going to go over them briefly. Most of the comments on the first page are redundant with comments that have been made previously during the last Planning and Zoning Commission meeting as part of the public hearing. However, I just wanted to lay this out as my understanding of where things stand with a couple of general issues. The first being whether the town has actually consented to the application. Again, it's my understanding that there's no documentation that the town is a co-applicant or has consented to participating in this application or has agreed to be bound by it in any decision made regarding it. Consequently, it's also my understanding that the approval of any site plan or site plan modification cannot create an obligation on the part of the owner of any abutting property not subject to such an application to accommodate or continue to accommodate the needs of a property subject to the application. In other words, the development that's proposed on the Branford Housing Authority property, in my opinion as staff, is requiring access across town-owned property. And because the town has not consented to the application, they're not a co-applicant. And this has been stated, I think, at the public hearing previously, that there's no agreement on the town's part to provide or continue to provide such access, even if that condition of that driveway is open now, there's no obligation to continue to leave that open. Again, it's my understanding that even though there was a statement by Attorney Hollister that there's some kind of presumptive or informal right-of-way, that there in fact is no right-of-way for the driveway. So the Sliney Field Access Road is actually a driveway on a private property. It's not a street. There is no right-of-way associated with it. In fact, previous applications for this proposed development included a provision to discontinue the use of Sliney Field Road, so-called, to motorized vehicles. If you recall, that was to be converted originally to a pedestrian and bike access when there was going to be a connection to Melrose Avenue. Also wanted to provide an example to the commission of another circumstance in which an adjoining property owner was required to participate in an application. This involves the Thimble Islands Brewery. You may recall there was a proposal to use parking on abutting property. I think it was 14 Business Park Drive, directly adjacent, right next to the Thimble Islands Brewery site. And the applicant was told that that abutting property owner needed to be a co-applicant in the application, or they needed to agree to provide an easement to allow the use of their property for circulation through a parking area on the Thimble Islands Brewery property, as well as parking that was to be provided on that adjoining property for the benefit of Thimble Islands Brewery. That application was actually withdrawn. I did attach a copy of the documentation from that application for you, just so we have the example on the record. Just a couple other comments about some of the statements made in the letter dated September 30th. There are a number of comments in there about specific potential encumbrances, that a wall, a fence across the so-called Sliney Field access drive. I mean, those are just examples of things that could occur. I think the concern is much more general in nature, regards any potential obstruction that could occur. I certainly can't, as staff, foresee all such possible obstacles or encumbrances that might be placed on the property. So it's general in nature, and some of the specific responses don't cover all the circumstances that might eventuate. However, with respect to a couple of specific comments, again, this was alluded to by Attorney Hollister, Section 6.28E, and the text I provided as at the end of the memo, I think on page 3 of 4 of the memo, does not prohibit a fence or freestanding wall that's less than 6 feet in height from being constructed right up to the property line. There is a prohibition in that section against locating a fence or wall within the right-of-way of any street. Again, in my opinion as staff, that does not apply because there is no street and there's no right-of-way. Again, specifically with respect to comment in the September 30th memo, with respect to the discussion about Section 613 of the zoning regulations, there is no requirement that the Planning and Zoning Commission approve a freestanding wall or fence. One that's over 6 feet in height needs to obtain a zoning permit and needs to obey the setbacks. But it simply needs a zoning permit that's issued by the zoning enforcement officer. A freestanding wall or fence that's under 6 feet and under in height does not need any approval under the zoning regulations. And again, just provided the text of Section 6.3 at the very end of the memo for you. That's all I have at the moment.
Great, thanks. Any questions for Harry from anyone? If not,
Well, the first,
sure, go
I
ahead.
have one quick question. So the current, in your opinion, the current access from onto the property is not a true right-of-way in a legal sense?
It's not my opinion as an attorney. It's really my opinion as a town planner that there's no, I've seen no documentation that there's any kind of status with respect to the so-called Solani Field Access Road as any kind of town highway, road, or street.
Right now, it's an access, but not specifically a right-of-way.
Right.
Okay.
It's really analogous in my mind to a driveway that's open to the public, as in any kind of private development like Walmart or something.
Thanks, Harry.
Anything else? Chief Heffernan, are you available?
Good evening.
Good evening. And Chief, I don't know, I'm sure we have some questions, but do you have any comments? I don't know if you had a chance to review the various reports and if you want to start out. And
I have
give
reviewed, thank you, I have reviewed some of the reports. And just to touch base on Mr. Hollister's letter, the 30th, item number 5, I do not have the legal authority to stop someone from doing something on their property as a result of a development on their neighbor's property. So here where he states that it would require my approval to build something on the town property adjacent to Parkside, and that I would have to deny that as a result of the approvals from Parkside, I do not have the legal authority to do that.
Have you ever been asked to do that?
No, but there's no provisions in the fire code that would allow me to do that. I would have to refer to the town attorney to that authority.
Okay.
There has been discussion, and I received TPA's plan showing the enlarged pullover that brings the vehicle completely onto the Parkside property. And that works in the ideal world on paper. But what I would like to share with you is the reality that we deal with in the fire service in situations like this. So this packet here is a complex that looks pretty similar to the proposed complex at Parkside Village. This is a 54-unit building, fully sprinklered, 66,000 square feet, 3-story. So what makes it different than the park side. The park side is 4 stories on one side. It has 13 more units, 8,000 more square feet. And this is a building in Detroit that last week burned and resulted in 6 injured occupants as well as an injured firefighter. So if you flip over to page 2, you'll see an aerial of this building. And you'll see how much access there was for the firefighters to be able to fight the fire at this location. You know, we've talked about the need to get an aerial truck in there, and in my last letter I talked about the need to have room for mutual aid assignments and mutual aid fire engines and aerial trucks. Well, this was in Detroit, and they're obviously a much bigger fire department and have much more staffing than the town of Brantford. So if you look on page 3, you'll see that on this fire, over on the right side here, shows you the units that responded to the fire in this building. They had 8 fire engines, 4 ladder trucks, and 3 squads. Those took up a substantial amount of space because it was a really substantial fire in this fully sprinkled building. So on page 4, you could see a picture of this building burning. And then on page 5, you could see a drone photograph of this building burning. And you could see that to fight this fire and to evacuate the occupants of these 54 apartments, it took 4 aerial ladders. And you could see those in these photos. And you could see the vast amount of area that's needed to operate in this type of situation. All those yellow squiggly lines you see are all hose lines. And those are all 4-inch diameter hoses that run from hydrants and from truck to truck. We need spaces to put those in. And as we continue onto page 6, you'll see that even a block away, additional apparatus are needed to provide water to fight that fire. And as you continue, you'll see on page 7, additional operations. And then page 8, the aftermath, as well as on page 9. That was a catastrophic fire in a building not much different than the building that's proposed. To create a small niche or a little notch there on this property to fit one fire truck, that works for those minor fires. But to say that we don't need to access the surrounding property in the event of a fire is not realistic. I don't dispute Mr. Versteeg and Mr. Hollister's comments that we could drive a fire truck anywhere. And that's why we want this project to receive an easement to guarantee that we could drive this fire truck and any fire truck anywhere we need to. But a future development in these spaces could prevent that by building stationary objects that we can't drive over. Yeah, I could push a passenger car out of the way. I could push over a chain link fence with a fire truck. But I can't move a building. I can't move a 6-foot stone wall. So we need some type of assurance that I'm going to be able to place my apparatus in a very similar position to the apparatus that are pictured on page 5 here.
Thank you, Chief. Question, have you reviewed the site plan? How much area, whether it's an easement or permission, or I don't want to be stuck on what it is, but how much area do you need of the town property would you like to have access to?
Well, I have a plan from, oh, it's bigger, I could read the numbers. All right. So I see a plan here from Attorney Hollister today that shows a very small area that I definitely feel is inadequate. And this is the plan here that shows just a small highlighted area. Right. I am looking at a plan that was submitted on the 25th by it's Newman Architects, this one here, that shows the ability for the the apparatus to drive almost completely over to the concession stand at Sliney and back up and turn around. And while that space would definitely be beneficial to do that, and it would be necessary to do that, I would say we need access through that entire area all the time, not just to turn apparatus around.
Could you show me that on the map, just the approximate area you're talking about?
So they've drawn, let's see, here we go. So this is the path that they took and put our fire apparatus on the auto turn and brought it up here, shows it off into the turnoff for the fire department placement, and then back all the way down to here, backs in. This is the original Little League field here. This is the concession stand at Sliney right here, and it comes back over and drives out. We would need to be able to access that entire area at any given time.
Okay.
For apparatus placement, to lay down hose, to put those numerous vehicles that we need to. Because if you look at the current site plan, there's not a place to fit 8 fire engines. There's not a place to put 4 aerial ladders.
Just back, you said 8 fire engines. Do you think you would need 8 fire engines? Is that typical?
When Castellan's burned,
Okay,
we had 5 ladder trucks,
right.
coming all the way from West Haven and New Haven. And we had about 10 fire engines when Main Street Castellan's burned. So to put things into perspective of what we need and what we use, yeah, I think there's a very realistic number.
Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt. So
That's okay. So it follows this plan, and you can see where they've traced out the vehicle and its turning area, and we need to follow that same plan.
Okay.
We're in agreement with them that this is the space we need.
Okay, so you'd like that access to be available to you to service this site for emergency purposes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Especially in a catastrophic event.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Can I ask you a question? What about South Monterey Street and the parking lot? Those are available to you, are they not?
Well, the parking lot, the hose is a 4-inch hose. So once it's on the ground, you can't drive over it. So the first piece of apparatus is going to connect to that fire department connection right in the entrance and go into this front door area. So that's really going to limit our access through here. The center aisle is fairly narrow, that once we put a ladder truck out and its outriggers, which extend out 16 feet, we're not going to be able to drive by it. South Monterey Street, between the combination of power lines and this large knoll that's going to remain, we would not be able to access that as well.
Sir, you approved this plan in 2017 and 2018, did you not?
Is this where the...
Well, he has the right to ask you questions, but no, he can ask the questions. He can ask a...
This is not the plan I approved in 17.
What's different? With the building, South Monterey and the parking lot, what's different in 2018?
I would have to review those plans. I've seen so many different versions.
It hasn't changed.
I have a question for you. I'm looking
Okay.
at your letter
Yep.
from 2019.
Yep.
Where the original, as my understanding is, the conditions that Mr. Hollister is questioning here, I think it's 5C or 5D, I forget.
Okay. On which letter of 19?
That was, this is a letter of March 29, 2019, where you were commenting on a plan, and I'll just read. It says, "The emergency access provided via the driveway on the north side of the development, aka Sunny Lode, crosses to the property of the town of Brantford. As a result, the following information shall be provided." And it goes on, it says that a maintenance agreement, that a maintenance agreement is entered into providing around-the-clock year-round access, that no additional improvements or modification to this area or to the immediate adjacent area may be made without approval of the Brantford Fire Marshal, and such improvements or modification may require the applicant of the proposed development to provide alternate approved emergency access to the westerly portion of the development.
Okay.
So that's what I believe, Harry, am I correct? That's what we were using when we crafted that condition. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, so this was what I was reading,
Yep.
this is what you said earlier
Yes.
in March, that that they can't, that because they crossed over, what you didn't do there, and that's why I'm asking tonight, is you didn't define what the exact area is. You said improvements to this area and to the immediate adjacent area may be made without, you can't change them without your approval.
Yes, that's correct.
So am I correct in understanding that the earlier application is that you wanted to ensure that the surrounding area, as I read it, that remained as is or was unobstructed?
Exactly, and it's accessible, and we've seen changes in grade here. So
Right.
now areas that were easily traversed by foot are now much steeper grade. We've now seen versions of retaining walls. So access to the backside of this building is now solely through that one set of stairs on the outside.
Right.
So as we look about how to get onto this property, carrying 35-foot ladders, it's pretty limiting.
Right. I just, the original emanation of this application, there was access through Melrose. It was going to come right down.
Yeah.
And I think that there was, my understanding that included coming in from up there and use, again, of the entire
that whole
parking
space,
lot.
yes.
And that was the assumptions then.
Yes.
Once that got out, then I read your letter even on the next version as saying we need to have access to the surrounding area. And I mean, that's...
Yeah, and I may not have been clear, but it's always been the intent that the current parking lot remains accessible as a whole.
Right, right. And frankly, my understanding is there've been a lot of, I mean, there was a land swap proposed. And frankly, in the past, there has been, I assume, cooperation even to come to that land swap. And this issue hadn't really come into the core until this most recent application about how much you'll actually need.
That's correct.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Does staff have any questions? Mr. Hollister, you have some questions?
I have some comments, and I don't have any more questions.
Okay. Okay. Are there, why don't we, do you have any other comments, Chief?
No.
Okay.
Yep.
Any members of the public wish to comment? Yes, come forward. Yeah, thank you, Chief.
Carolyn Sires, 94 Indian Neck, 20 Linden Shores in Branford. I'll be very brief, but this may help out. So this was after last meeting when Marcy and a few others asked the question, and this is relevant to the town of Branford. I had called the Branford Police Department for Parkside Village Call for Services because I was also concerned at how many vehicles from the period of January 1st of 2018 to September 19th of 2019 are engaged in calls when Parkside Village makes a 911 call. So this is just from the Branford Police Department statistics. It says there have been a total of 73 calls made from Parkside Village 1 since 2018, which warranted the following response of emergency vehicles. 52% of calls were handled by the Branford Fire Department, which includes EMS. On an average, 3 emergency vehicles are dispatched to calls overseen by the fire department. This isn't catastrophic, this is just regular. So it's an average of 3. 48% of the calls are handled by the Branford Police Department. On an average, 2 units are dispatched to calls overseen by the police department. So I would gladly hand you out the statistics. So this is not catastrophic. This is real-day statistics. So if you get a 1 unit calling the fire and 1 unit calling the police, you're looking at 5 units of vehicles that need to get on that property. And that is not catastrophic. So I think it's really important when thinking about the vehicles, the turnaround, and the amount of space needed that we do think catastrophic, because in real time with the unit you have, this is 3 and 2 units. So I think that's important to consider for use of property.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other members of the public wish to comment?
Clarice Begemon, live at 41 Highland Avenue. It just seems to me that this has been a moving target for Beacon. I've been at the last 2 hearings regarding the what they've been given with to try to make work with what you've given them. And it just seems that if there's a property that's owned by the Housing Authority, there's a property that's owned by the town of Brantford. If we really wanted to work together and get this project approved, it's doable. And it's really disheartening to see a process like this. I support the housing development. There are people who need this housing. They need improvement. So I wish there can be a solution.
Thank you. Any other members of the public wish to comment? Any questions from commissions or staff? Or Mr. Hollister, do you have some further comments?
First, let me respond to Mr. Smith's additional comments. He said that we should get consent from the town, and my question is, consent to what? You don't need to ask consent for an emergency vehicle to drive over private or public property. If that were the case, then if we need approval from the town to get emergency vehicle access to our building, then we start at the firehouse and we follow all the streets through the town of Brantford until you get to 115 South Montague Street, and we would need permission from the town across that entire route. And so would every other property owner that wants fire truck access or emergency vehicle access. That's absurd. That doesn't make any sense. Mr. Smith said that there's no right-of-way in the existing driveway. Well, there is a right-of-way because people use it to get to the park, but even if there isn't one now, there will be when because we have agreed to condition 2E, which is a public access easement. And by the way, Mr. Smith says that there's no vehicle access. It's a fire lane. Fire trucks are specifically going to be designated as able to use that parkside portion of Sliney Road to get to the pullover, to get to access to the park, wherever they need to get to. So there will be a right-of-way there. And the next question is, why in heaven's name would anyone build a fence or a wall in that location? We can speculate, somebody might, but no one has come up with a realistic prediction or reason as to why anyone would completely disrupt the park, why anyone would build a fence or a wall in that location. We haven't heard that, and this matter should not be based on just completely erroneous speculation. I have to also question the fire marshal. If someone proposed to build a wall or a fence or an obstruction anywhere in the town of Brantford that would obstruct fire access, he's the fire marshal. That's his responsibility, is to object to that and make sure that it doesn't happen. So he can say, I don't have the authority to do it on private property. Well, yes, if it's not obstructing, but if it's obstructing access for emergency vehicles, absolutely it is within his domain. And finally, I'm just very disappointed because we have been over this plan for 2 years, and now we're hearing about fire access, things that we never heard before that are not on the table. The purpose of this application is not to revise the fire safety routes and access. It is to amend or clarify the condition. Now, before I finish, I want to have Mr. Versteeg make one more comment.
Joe Versteeg for the applicant. The fire safety code only requires that a fire truck be able to drive within 50 feet of an exterior door that provides access inside the building. The other requirement is that from that point or from other multiple points, that firefighters on foot have access around the building and travel not more than 450 feet, either starting at one point and circling the entire building and coming back to that same point, or starting at that same point and each walking not more than 450 feet and meeting in the back. And that is achieved, and the fire safety code has been satisfied for this building on fire department vehicle access. And that's all that's required. What's been provided is above and beyond. The other thing I'd like to note, the packet that was handed out with the gloom and doom, the fires, you will notice that none of those ladder trucks are affecting rescue. They're all back at a great distance, squirting water on this building. We have to research through the Detroit Fire Department, which we'll do tomorrow, to find out whether or not this was a sprinkler building. Because the reports we have from CNN, although via the internet right now, where I suspect these came from as well, and you know how accurate that is. The fire in this building started outside. It's suspected to be an arson, and then the chairs were thrown into the front lobby. No one was killed. 6 people were injured. Remember that they were all elderly, 65 and up. 1 firefighter was injured, smoke inhalation. 2 police officers were injured, but no one required rescue. There was no statements that people were required to be rescued from this building. There's no indication that their egress was impeded and they were unable to egress. But I suspect that this building burned to the ground. It was not a sprinkler building. You would not have had a fire that big. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hefner, do you have a comment?
I've had multiple conversations with Chief Kelvin Harris from the Detroit Fire Department. He's the one who provided me with those photographs. That building was sprinklered by a 13R sprinkler system, and there were, in effect, rescues made from that building. Those apparatus were holding the fire at bay while they evacuated the unburned wing of that building.
Thank you.
Well, one thing I hope we can all agree on is that everything that could be said has been said, so I'm going to finish by reiterating what we are asking you to do. And please, don't anybody think that no matter what happens tonight, if you deny our request, that this application is dead and going away. It's not. The specific request is that you approve the relocation of the pullover onto the Parkside property. Let's at least eliminate the deed restriction issue for that pullover. Number 2, modify 5C and 5D as we requested in our August 26th letter. And number 3, make Attorney Bercury's August 14th clarification letter part of your approval. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from Harry?
Can you hold 1 minute, please?
Sure. Anything else? No. Okay. So can we close this matter? Okay, we'll close this matter as a public hearing. My concern is we have a regular member who's not here tonight, Marcy, and I don't know if we want to start deliberations. Once we start deliberating, it would be the 5 of us. My concern would be that she would need to watch the tape and participate. So I don't know. I don't feel like comfortable just saying she can't be involved, which she would be if she. I don't know what.
Well, also, Paul, I don't know if you've got a chance to. I don't even know if we got the recording too. Yeah.
Okay, so we can't do it anyway because Paul hasn't done. Okay, so I think we'll probably deliberate at our next meetings. So that's what our likely schedule is. We're not going to deliberate tonight, so you can go home and we will. Next meeting is the first. What is it, October 3rd?
17th.
October 17th. October 17th. Okay. With that, why don't we take a short break and we can move on to our agenda. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. There's nothing big. Okay. Great. Okay, we'll call our meeting back to order. This time we can bring back the first public hearing item, which was actually number 2 in the agenda, 1064 Main Street LLC. That was the application to special exception to add 5 one-bedroom and 3 efficiency apartments, convert the office to residential in the center of town. And we had a staff report on that. Didn't appear to have any, there was no public comment. Seems like a good thing. We wanted to add that condition about the parking. Oh, can you?
Want me to read that again?
Okay.
On-street parking on Main Street and Hillside Avenue is limited to 2-hour durations. The owner shall inform the residential tenants that on-street parking may not exceed 2-hour intervals. Off-street parking is available on site, 18 parking spaces, along with nearby public parking opportunities.
Okay.
Got it.
So does everyone agree? Looks good?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So someone wants to make a motion to approve the application with the conditions on pages 4 and 5. There's, I believe, 4 conditions, and then the added condition that Rich just read about the parking. So moved by Joe. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Joe. Further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Okay, so that one's approved. So let's go through our agenda item for minutes. Were the minutes were sent to us, were they, I thought I saw a note that they were incomplete, but they look pretty complete.
There was some additional discussion we did not have time to really include in the draft copy, so we would request a little bit more time.
Okay.
We did file with the town clerk's office as we needed to under FOI, but we just were looking for a little more time to flesh that out, and the rush of business didn't have it, so.
Okay, so we'll just defer on the minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Any correspondence?
We have one piece of correspondence with respect to a cell tower at 10 Sylvia Street. And again, with respect, I think there's a similar application, or the same application, there's another piece of correspondence regarding it. That's, again, another antenna swap in an existing telecommunications facility.
Okay.
That's it.
Great. Okay, old business. Item number 1 is the Peter Henschel Revocable Trust. We have a public hearing scheduled for that at our next meeting on the 17th. Item number 2, that's the hybrid zoning amendment, BL to BLHR. That's also scheduled for a public hearing at our next meeting. And item number 3 is that's a regulation amendment. I guess the other one's a map amendment. So that's the same thing also for a public hearing on the 17th. Item number 4, 3 Elms Road. I believe that's a Stony Creek matter. It's scheduled for a public hearing on the 17th. And item number 5, Brand Farm installation of parking lot, also scheduled for a public hearing on the 17th.
That's correct.
Very busy on the 17th.
We are.
Long night.
Yep.
Yeah.
For new business, we have 3 items listed. The first one is a zoning map amendment from R4 to R1 for Bourbon Drive. And we need to schedule that for public hearing.
Yeah. Just going back to all the items we have on the 17th, I'm looking at a couple of them.
Right.
I think one of the ones, particularly the one at 3 Elms Road, is a fairly complicated item. I mean, it's entirely possible that may not be ready.
That would be great.
And the applicant may want to continue that or continue without testimony to the 7th of November. That also would be the last day the commission would have, the last date on which the commission could take a vote regarding the Parkside application.
Okay.
So looking at the 3 items of new business, typically we would schedule them on the 7th. I don't know what the commission's pleasure is, but to do all of that in the 7th, potentially with, if necessary, if we can't do it at the next meeting, a vote on Parkside plus possibly one of the other applications that's scheduled for the 17th might be a lot too. So They did come in the order, they're listed here, so the Bourbon Drive zoning map amendment did come in before the Summit Place applications, which just, so I think everyone's aware, that was discussed informally at a previous meeting and involves the final portion of this property that's owned by the Vigliottis at the end of Summit Place. The two existing buildings were converted to incentive housing zone, and the back piece of the property had the potential for another 50-odd units, and that was not approved originally by the commission.
Wasn't like they wanted 3 buildings at one time, Harry, and we approved 2 to see how it would work out? 'Cause
They wanted one large one and the 2
changing
existing
the
ones.
occupancy.
Exactly. That's
Right.
exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So now they feel like it worked, so they want to build a 3rd building.
That's
Right.
exactly right. Yeah.
Makes sense.
So the 21st, or you
The 21st, I think, for at least one of the projects might be prudent.
Okay, so how about all of these on the 21st,
Okay.
given the agenda? And it would be great if, for the 3 Elms Road one, if we could just open and continue that, given all the stuff we have to do
Okay.
at our next meeting.
Okay.
So maybe you can speak with the applicant.
We will. We'll. I know there are several issues, and we'll get those organized in writing and communicate with the applicant. Okay.
Okay. That's it? Well,
think
do you have
that's
a
it.
planner's report?
I really have nothing additional to report. As was noted, I think, by Rich, the Main Streets Overlay District did take effect on October 1st. And we're hoping to get you new, fresh copies of the zoning regulations all cleaned up. I have a almost final draft, so the last things we just approved, that just became effective, the non-agricultural farm events regulation, I will put that in here. We just actually finalized the text and the changes and sent that off to the applicant. I think it went in the mail today. So when I get that inserted in here, we'll get that printed and we'll get you a copy of that. And we also have a cleaned up copy of the zoning map coming and the final version of the plan of conservation development. So we'll get a printed copy of that. All those documents we'll get to you as soon as we can.
Okay. Okay, anything else? No, I think, any motion to adjourn? Second? For discussion, all in favor? Aye.
This program was brought to you in part through the support of the Town of Brantford. Watch town meetings and other videos on demand at BrantfordTV.org.